Good afternoon. Welcome back. We have reached our final panel of the afternoon, and I'm so pleased to see so many people still in the seats. Thank you all for sticking it out through what has been an unbelievably insight-filled and educational day, for me at least, and probably for a lot of folks in the audience. Can we have one more round of applause for everyone? So my name is Dr. Candace Burton. I am full-time faculty here at UCI in the Sue and Bill Gross School of Nursing. We just got that name recently, so I have to say it a lot. Sue and Bill Gross School of Nursing. I am a researcher on the impact, the physiological and psychosocial impacts of trauma on women's health and lives, and I'm so pleased to be part of this panel today to moderate for these amazing women who've generated some fantastic work that I'm excited to share with you. And one of the reasons I'm very happy to be here is because some of the very first work on intimate partner violence as a health issue was actually done by nurses. So I feel like I'm contributing to my profession by being here and holding up the flame. And so this panel is going to refer to science-informed solutions through a critical lens. And as a nurse scientist, this was a very appealing opportunity for me to be part of this panel and to welcome my fellow scientists here to talk about their work as well. And one of the things I wanted to just touch on was the difference between what we call evidence, probably in this room, as opposed to what we call evidence in nursing. We often talk about evidence-based practice and using the science to generate better and more improved practice. So I just wanted to point out the fact that it's really difficult to do a randomized controlled trial of intimate partner violence. And I'm very grateful that there are folks here who are doing science from the other side of that lens. And so I want to go ahead and introduce the panelists here. To my left is Jamie Abrams, and she's going to talk about the externalities of family violence. Her research is focused on internal forces rather than external. So when we talk about structural forces in the impact of intimate partner violence on families, this is what Jamie's going to address. To her left is Courtney Cross. Courtney is going to talk about what I think is a really interesting application of the harm reduction model in a domestic violence context, using this framework to help law enforcement to understand the broader picture and the survivor as an active agent rather than a passive agent. And finally, sneaking in over there with Casey, who is hopefully asleep. Did it work? Yay, okay, maybe we should whisper. Okay. Is Carrie Bettinger-Lopez, who you have already met today, and she's going to talk a little bit about creating a national plan of action on violence against women and gender-based violence, a human rights approach in the United States. Go ahead, Jamie.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I know lots of folks have thanked the conference organizers, but I want to offer a especially personalized thank you. I'm here from Kentucky, home of the first state to call the election for Donald Trump, and the birthplace of libertarian politics, fried chicken, horse abuse, and alcoholism, frankly. So my school suspended, 3 months ago, my school suspended all conference travel whatsoever and any scholarly support for faculty. So I am extra grateful because I literally would not be here without the support that UCI provided to me. And as a junior scholar, I just can't afford that kind of a cut. So I could not be more appreciative and humbled to be surrounded by the who's who of this conversation. This project for me urged me to imagine if activists seeking to end domestic violence could reframe its politicization and tell the story from scratch. How would the political and social problems be framed if we were to start today? What legal solutions would we craft, and who would be accountable for the results? I argue in my paper that the domestic violence movement is politicized around the internalities of domestic violence in ways that historically served a critical role bringing domestic violence into the public frame and shaping critical interventions, but in ways that immunize the state from accountability by positioning the crisis of domestic violence and accountability for effective interventions squarely on survivors and survivor support networks. Expanding the politicization of domestic violence around domestic violence's externalities is a critical, albeit uncomfortable, shift to move from intervening in domestic violence to ending domestic violence. I identify 3 key characteristics that shape the modern politicization of domestic violence. First, its construction around internalities. Second, its framing as a one-sided crisis. And third, its power paradox of autonomy and accountability for survivors. First, internalities are, in the paper I describe them as the condition of being internal or contained within. Domestic violence being politicized as internal to the relationship in which it occurs. In this framing, there are two primary actors, the victim and the perpetrator. Other actors, such as law enforcement, social support networks, lawyers, the state, intervene to assist once initiated, but the problem and the legal responses to it are understood and defined by its internalities. Missing from this frame are the ways in which externalities can play a critical role in exacerbating, triggering, and facilitating violence. Some examples include economic distress, prior family abuse, job distress, mental illness, larger gender or structural inequalities, and changes in custody or parenting status. There are considerable strengths to an internalities framing. It uniquely grew out of domestic violence as understood by survivors and the consciousness-raising dialogues that built much of the movement. It gave voice to a silent epidemic historically insulated in the family without state intervention or response. And giving voice to those experiences of survivors and developing responses to those survivors' experiences is perhaps the single greatest accomplishment of the second wave feminist movement. From a politicization perspective, however, an internalities framing politicizes domestic violence as if it spontaneously erupts out of the relationship. The iconic cycle of violence visually depicts and explains abuse as a single victim and single perpetrator on a continuous cycle without externalities or collateral harms to family, community, employers, the economy. It pretends that abuse sustains itself on this cycle within the family unit without consideration of political, economic, social, legal, or medical contexts. Risk assessments for lethality are another example of the limits of internalities in that they ask victims about internalities only. The focus is on the contained unit. How at risk is this victim for future violence from this perpetrator? Yet recidivism research reveals even if that victim successfully exited that abusive relationship, a new victim of the same abuser would likely emerge. An internalities frame alone may be insufficient from the perspective of state accountability. Second, domestic violence is addressed and framed as a crisis, but importantly, that crisis framing politicizes the victims needing support as the crisis. Only secondarily, or not at all, are the perpetrators politicized as the root of the crisis. Crisis could mean many things. And one reading of it, it could mean a vitally important or decisive stage in a process or a political moment, a decisive change. This meaning would very closely align with the historic work that the battered women's movement did in moving domestic violence onto the law reform agenda in the 1970s and beyond. This movement ruptured the discourse and revealed a true political crisis in need of a public response. The crisis term, though, could also be framed in a more medicalized frame as a turning point in an illness or a disease or a condition. Victims call crisis hotlines. They receive crisis interventions. We deploy crisis responses. But this medicalized frame might distort the depth and systemic long-term nature of domestic abuse and the harms it inflicts on the victim, their children, employers, and other community members. It risks politicizing a faulty narrative that domestic violence has a beginning and an end from the state perspective and includes decisive transformative moments. A crisis framing minimizes the state's accountability for the victim's longer-term recovery and wellness and to address the perpetrators more proactively and urgently. The burden is left to social services and nonprofits to meet those needs, but they are contingent on survivors' willingness to accept services and service providers' ability to meet needs. Batterers are notably not framed as part of the crisis. There are certainly interventions for perpetrators, such as incarceration or batterers' intervention programs, but these interventions are normalized within the larger criminal justice system and are not framed as a crisis worthy of decisive state response. Third, the survivor is positioned as the initiator, investigator, and information provider accountable for effective domestic violence responses. This creates a paradox whereby the goal of achieving survivor autonomy is politicized so as to leave survivors uniquely accountable for the efficacy of our interventions. DV risk assessments are a good example. These lethality assessments ask questions that are very much focused on the internalities of violence. Her prior victimization, his drug and alcohol abuse, jealousy and obsessive behaviors, threats. These risk assessments are distinctly intended to empower victims, yet they implicitly immunize the state from its own accountability for investigating lethality and making objective determinations. It positions the victim as the access point to all risk assessment and politicizes the state in a responsive role only. If the assessment is faulty, it's presumably because the victim did not adequately sense the risks or did not take the services that were provided. I then identify in the paper some preliminary ways we might recast the politicization of domestic violence to focus on ending domestic violence, breaking us out of a cycle of repeated interventions. First, I suggest that externalities of domestic violence should also be considered. Externalities describe the state of being external to the relationship. For example, economics, inequality, health, job loss, court interventions. Masculinities theory could offer a critical parallel lens to explain which externalities may be particularly relevant. The masculinities can reveal powerful triggers of hypermasculine acts of violence and powerful institutional and cultural forces. The NFL's response to domestic violence might be a good example of the limits of internalities. Imagine if the NFL had really understood the role it plays as an institution in using the power of the NFL to change behaviors. Instead, the NFL mimicked an internalities response that will intervene if victims come forward. Second, relatedly, we might have more vigilance in monitoring the role of the state as a provoker of domestic violence. A consequence of an internalities frame is that the state is poised on the outside, ready to act. But this ignores how the state can create the very culture of hypermasculinity and provoke hypermasculine acts of violence. Consider, for example, the role of the state handling child support delinquencies, where the public shaming aspects might merit further consideration when we consider the role that they play perpetuating a toxic masculinity. Traditional judicial trainings also focus on internalities. This internalities approach really emphasizes, it works to dispel myths, but it doesn't acknowledge how the state itself might be provoking an act of violence in its engagement with the couple. Third, the state might be more empowered to prevent these acts. The state plays a reactive and a stagnant role today. It holds little accountability for violence itself. When the state does get involved, it often lacks accountability, and this is particularly powerful for recidivist offenders. Consider, for example, in contrast, the way we handle DUIs or DWIs. The state perceives a role for itself in an accountability to future victims of the same offender in its strong recidivist models. Another example might be the number of states that only use a consider or a permissive approach to looking at domestic violence in family custody proceedings. We might imagine a stronger role in bankruptcy proceedings from an externalities perspective. We might imagine a stronger role for the state warning would-be victims. For example, in contrast, in the context of adult caregiving, some states have passed laws requiring a vulnerable adult services provider database and incentivizing employers to inspect and look for repeat offenders before hiring. The state might also hold a greater preventative accountability in the context of the child welfare system to mitigate future family violence. The state might imagine a greater role for lawyers. Many of us as lawyers in the room representing victims have taken on the role of safety planning with our clients, but on the respondent side, one would not find research suggesting the need for safety planning with the respondent or any complex client counseling for the attorney representing the abuser. Yet in tort law, we do impose liabilities on individuals with special relationship to warn of particular risks to known victims. Finally, how does the domestic violence movement connect to and align with larger social and political movements today? There is a risk that the movement could lose its collective identity by essentialing itself around the who, the gendered binary, and the what of the domestic violence services model. While the internalities of domestic violence served an important early purpose of achieving political identity and formation of the domestic violence movement, it might have limitations from a modern political perspective. Moving toward a more expansive politicization might include aligning with movements for more systemic change. And many feminist scholars in the room, such as Lee Goodmark, Donna Coker, Deborah Weissman, and many others, have previously advocated strongly for these types of directional shifts. It is time to consider the synergies between the goals of the domestic violence movement and other social justice causes. Might the modern political climate require new solutions and new ideas? So in my paper, I argue specifically for a broader politicization of domestic violence to include its externalities, seeking to hold the state more accountable as a provoker and a better preventer of domestic violence.
Hi everyone, thank you so much to UCI for hosting this fabulous event and for allowing me to be a part of it. I know we are all anxiously awaiting Professor Crenshaw, so I will do my best to be brief. I know Casey's very excited to hear her for the first time. So I'm here to talk to you a little bit about a proposal that I think might aid in the process of decoupling the domestic violence movement from the carceral state. And my proposition is that the domestic violence movement intentionally and explicitly incorporate the basic principles and tenets of the public health philosophy of harm reduction into its everyday work and into its long-term goals. Currently in the United States, harm reduction doesn't play much of an explicit role in the domestic violence movement, but we'll talk a little bit today about how it is implicitly involved, I think, in a lot of the work that a lot of us do every single day. But I think that the two concepts are very compatible, and I think that the more that activists and advocates and scholars can think about embracing harm reduction as part of serving survivors of domestic violence, I think it'll benefit survivors, and I also think that it will repoliticize the domestic violence movement in a good way, as it will cause us to think a little bit more about our relationship with the state and about policies that are taking choices away from survivors. So the first thing I want to start by addressing is sort of what is this concept of harm reduction. If you're thinking about it and you're thinking that you've probably heard about it in other contexts, that's most likely correct. So harm reduction is a public health philosophy, sort of a cluster of principles that was developed and is typically applied in the context of working with individuals engaging in high-risk behavior. And so the context that it's probably gained the most notoriety is in the substance use context. So needle exchange programs, methadone usage, even e-cigarettes are all forms of harm reduction that are used to try to mitigate the damages, the dangers that individuals engaging in that substance consumption may be exposed to. So when we talk about harm reduction, we're talking about a couple basic ideas. One of the linchpins of harm reduction is this idea that rather than sort of consisting of a specific mandate, what it's actually trying to do is improve the quality of life of individuals and do so by sort of addressing collateral dangers while not necessarily requiring that individual to abstain from the high-risk behavior itself. Harm reduction is focused a great deal on improving quality of life both for individuals and for their communities, and it does so by thinking about pragmatic and compassionate tools for progress as identified by those individuals and communities themselves in terms of how we may be able to sort of work towards change. And one of the things that I really like about harm reduction is that any step in the right direction is seen as a success. There are not hard to access and hard to achieve benchmarks that we need to be sort of struggling to achieve. Anything in the right direction we see as a success, and I think that that may apply very well in the domestic violence context. Because harm reduction is sort of intentionally broad so that it can be applied across lots of different frameworks, I think it might help to talk a little bit more about the examples that I named so that we can get a sense of how harm reduction actually operates with individuals and communities on the ground. So the first one that I had named was the needle exchange program. So in programs like that, individuals who are using drugs intravenously, mostly heroin, are provided with peer-to-peer outreach and education about safe drug use, and they're also provided with paraphernalia that will help them use drugs without, say, having to rely on dirty needles or sharing needles, with the ultimate goal not necessarily being the cessation of that drug use, but actually being the reduction of infection and disease in that person and improving their quality of life by trying to sort of immunize them from hepatitis C and other diseases and infections that you may get from sharing needles. In terms of methadone, that's another example where an opiate derivative is actually being prescribed to folks who are opioid addicts in the hopes that this sort of prescription will minimize the negative effects of the drug, will minimize withdrawal, will minimize cravings, but will also mimic some of those symptoms that has them going back to the drug to begin with, in the hopes that we can sort of get this usage under control, make sure that these folks are sort of in a safe setting, and ideally with the goal of slowly weaning folks off. But what we're not doing is saying, hey, you absolutely have to quit. This is cold turkey. You can never ingest this substance again. But I also want to flag the fact that harm reduction is not just used in the substance abuse context. We're most familiar with it there, but harm reduction frameworks have also been really, really effective in contexts in which vulnerable individuals are not receiving the kind of support and care from mainstream services that they ought to be. So one example of that would be sort of the first foray into harm reduction in the United States, which was in the early 1980s. Harm reduction was developed on grassroots level to respond to the HIV/AIDS crisis in the gay communities. So organizations sprung up of affected or at-risk individuals who were then providing peer-to-peer outreach and education, relational support, and also safe sex tools to try to ensure that folks who were engaging in this behavior that could come with this consequence were less likely to be put at risk and to be endangered by that choice. And another area where we have seen harm reduction be successful is in the context of supporting sex workers. So rather than saying that folks who exchange sex for money need to quit immediately, find a legitimate job, and sort of pull themselves up by the bootstraps, there are organizations that are essentially saying, we understand that you feel like you have to do this. You may have decided you want to do this. We would like you to do this in a way that will keep you safe. So what they're doing is providing both safe sex tools and safe drug use tools, because they know that there's a correlation between those activities, along with counseling, along with food and clothing, and also really critically social and relational support systems, so that folks are able to engage in the activities they may think they need to engage in, that they may be coerced into engaging in, without necessarily being as at risk of the spread of disease, as at risk of the isolation that may come with that behavior. So those are sort of other examples where harm reduction is used to sort of acknowledge that there is this high-risk behavior and to say, so how can we keep you safe while you're in this situation? So against this backdrop, I want to talk briefly about why I think harm reduction and domestic violence are so compatible. My guess is that all of us in this room practice harm reduction pretty regularly, from client counseling, where we acknowledge that it is the client who should be making decisions about how to move forward, and it's the client who best understands their own life and the way options may impact them, to providing clients with wraparound services or even referrals to meet their other equally pressing needs. I think we all are sort of going out of our way to implement implicitly a lot of these principles of harm reduction, which is essentially, you may be facing danger X, but we would also like to try to help you achieve not just your goal when it comes to the violence, but your goal sort of surrounding the violence as well. And I think that one of the reasons why we're all sort of so primed to be engaging in this kind of work has a lot to do with the background to how the domestic violence movement itself came to be in the late 60s and early 70s. I think the grassroots beginnings in which survivors were starting to share their stories and open their homes really speaks to why harm reduction resonates in this context, because early advocates and activists were saying to other survivors, let's talk about what to do about this domestic violence, but let's also talk about how we can rebuild your independence and how we can empower you to take the steps that you yourself have identified as being the path that you would like to go on from here, rather than what happens a lot now, which is an advocate saying, here are the things that I've decided that you should do in order to be safe. go forth and let me know how it goes, don't screw up. But in those early days, right, there was a lot more emphasis on self-determination and on agency and on empowerment. And there are a lot of scholars, many in this room, who are brilliantly urging that we return to those roots. And so essentially so am I. And I am saying that harm reduction can help us get back to the roots where women-centered and survivor-centered counseling and lawyering are sort of at the fore. So what I want to do now is sort of zoom in on one specific set of circumstances where I think incorporating harm reduction would really benefit survivors. And that is looking at the situation of survivors who stay in abusive relationships. I think that if we sort of cast the high-risk behavior that harm reduction has been created to address, if we say that that behavior is not the violence, but it's actually sort of the need to stay or the desire to stay in the relationship, I think we can see why survivors could really benefit from harm reduction informed frameworks. I think that there is some discussion around whether abusive partners themselves could benefit from harm reduction, and that may be a future piece. But right now I am sort of focusing on how this framework can work with can benefit the more vulnerable folks in this situation who are the survivors. So I think that this situation is specifically ripe for harm reduction because women survivors of any gender who choose to stay in violent relationships are now exposing themselves to the potential for not just danger from their partner themselves, but also to danger from the state. And we've talked a lot about how the state is not necessarily fulfilling some of its laudable goals about serving survivors, and that's a situation that we're going to talk about here because as we all know, the legal response to domestic violence is sort of getting the lion's share of national attention and funding when it comes to addressing this problem. And within the legal response, I think that the priority is separating the parties. I think that there are a lot of ways that the criminal and the civil system are saying to not even parties, but to partners in this admittedly violent relationship or unsafe relationship, the state is now involved, so you will go your separate ways. And there are a lot of reasons that that's not feasible. But before we get there, I want to dig in just a little bit more into the ways that the state is doing this. And so on the criminal side, we talked a little bit about mandatory arrests and no-drop prosecutions. There's also the fact that once a case is up and running, many prosecutors are going to ask for mandatory stay-away orders, insisting that the defendant have no physical contact, no electronic contact, no phone contact with the complaining witness, often sort of despite the wishes of the folks involved. And for survivors who are involved and who then decide maybe that they'd like to opt out of this process, they're then being punished for that on the back end by the issuance of material witness bench warrants, and sometimes even by the denial of crime victims' compensation funding that is essentially saying, if you're not doing it this way, you will now no longer receive the benefits that we might have been willing to provide for you. And on the civil side, we see judges essentially saying to the civil litigants, I don't care what you've agreed to, I am going to impose requirements as part of the civil protection order, and I am going to have the goal of keeping you apart, even if you might want a civil protection order that allows for contact, even if you might want to modify or vacate down the line. I think it's important you stay apart, therefore you're staying apart. And I think that that can be really challenging for folks who have decided that that may not be in their best interest. And we know that for a lot of survivors, there are a lot of very valid reasons that may cause an individual survivor to decide that they either aren't ready to, aren't able to, or aren't yet interested in leaving the relationship. We've talked a little bit, I think, today about how separation violence can affect that. We've talked a little bit about love, the desire to stay, about the financial inability to separate. And I think that harm reduction can be a really valuable tool for working with this, folks, because it would shift our paradigm from separate and then we will sort of be able to support to what can we do to help you before you might be able to leave this relationship. So that could look like anything from providing harm reduction counseling to doing safety planning to keep folks safe even in the relationship. We spend so much time safety planning in terms of once someone leaves or how to sort of stay separated, but safety planning even before the decision can be made about leaving. I think that that's another place where harm reduction could be beneficial. And finally, I think it could be beneficial in terms of really focusing on what are the other services, whether social or legal, that can help you gain the independence and stability that you've identified as being your goals. What can we do to help you get that? Is there housing counseling? Is there employment services? Is it food and clothing? Is it helping solve other legal needs? And I think that there is perhaps controversially some harm reduction informed argument that would tell us that providing those services to both parties in the relationship may actually be a smart move. If the survivor is saying that the violence is precipitated by or triggered by or exacerbated by some of the external factors that Jamie has identified, there may actually be a benefit to providing services to both parties and not solely to one party. So that is my sort of quick pitch for the incorporation of harm reduction into domestic violence work. I would be happy to answer any questions if you have them after. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I loved both of these presentations. This was great. Hi again, everybody. Hopefully baby Casey will stay sleeping this time, and I'll try to get through this as quickly as possible. I just want to also echo just the thanks for this. This has been an incredible day, so thank you, Jane. It's just, well, I'll give lots of rounds of applause at the end, but thank you. And I also just want to really thank the entire team here. Deb Weissman wrote on Facebook that it takes a village, and it sure does. So thank you to everybody who's been helping with Casey and just with all the planning for this. It's great. So I just want to pick up on exploring some of the themes that I left off with before and discuss the idea of a national plan of action on gender violence or violence against women. This is an idea, I think, whose time has come, and maybe given our political situation should be actually put on pause, or at least redirected to state and local arenas, as several others have noted, Elizabeth McDowell noted earlier. And I want to talk a little bit about what I mean by a national plan of action. So over the past 2 decades, and by the way, I'm going to be speaking with my international human rights law hat on right now, so kind of shifting back to my old self, pre-White House. But over the past 2 decades, international human rights treaties and monitoring bodies have called upon governments to formulate and implement national plans of action that would eliminate violence against women or gender violence. And such plans of action constitute strategic, long-term, multi-sectoral blueprints or programs of activity that are designed to address underlying causes of violence against women and to strengthen the systems that respond to it, as opposed to more reactive approaches. He's waking up. Okay. Lee?
Do you want to hand it over?
He might be okay. Let's see. We'll see. Many countries have heeded these calls, and I want to just show you a couple. They've adopted dedicated plans of action. Lee's like a baby whisperer in my book now, so hopefully this will be okay. Many countries have adopted these dedicated plans of action on violence against women, and the United Nations has adopted a handbook to guide countries for this. So you see, for example, this is the Australian plan to reduce violence against women and their children. Excuse me. This is the Cambodian National Plan of Action to prevent violence against women. This is in Tanzania, the Spanish plan, and some of them, as you'll see, talk about gender violence, others violence against women. This is the plan in Namibia, Plan of Action on Gender-Based Violence. And so in some countries, these plans focus on a particular form of violence, such as domestic violence or human trafficking, female genital mutilation and cutting, or forced marriage. And many national action plans on violence against women also set out measures to support victims and survivors. These include prevention, awareness raising and education, engaging men and boys, training and capacity building efforts, prosecution, punishment, rehabilitation of perpetrators, and research. So they really kind of span the gamut. And some countries have even developed second or third generation plans of action. They contain lessons learned or plans for implementation of earlier efforts. And these sometimes focus on specific groups of women or different forms of violence that weren't previously addressed. And so these action plans and strategies to address violence against women are increasingly adopted at the provincial and local levels as well. And that's where I want to kind of zoom in on. They've also been adopted by independent public and private institutions, including universities. Many countries have incorporated targets and activities that combat violence against women in other existing national action plans, such as health or HIV/AIDS, social inclusion and development, or integration and migration. So despite being a global leader in the violence against women arena, the United States has never, ever developed a national plan of action to combat violence against women or gender violence. And when pressed on this point by international bodies, and I've been at these hearings where I have pressed the United States government for why they don't have one, the US always argues that VAWA is our national plan of action. They say that VAWA was passed in '94, has been reauthorized 3 times, every time has increased protections and expanded the ambit of expanded its scope, and that it constitutes, and this is a quote from a hearing before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights in the Jessica Lenahan versus United States case in which I participated. The United States government via the State Department said that VAWA constitutes a, quote, comprehensive legislative package that has invested billions and billions of dollars, and they love to talk about the billions, toward protecting victims and preventing and responding to violence against women. The 2013 reauthorization of VAWA, as we talked about before, took the legislation in an increasingly progressive direction. It addressed multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination and disadvantage. But despite the substantial contributions, VAWA does not contain the core features of a national action plan. That's right.
I agree, Casey.
A strategic vision for ending violence against women in the United States, a declaration that violence against women is a human rights violation and a form of sex discrimination, or a set of goals or benchmarks to measure progress. VAWA doesn't identify the many laws, policies, and programs that, whether explicitly or not, affect survivors' lives, what I talked about earlier. And another shortcoming, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Another shortcoming is that since VAWA is more focused on the criminal justice arena, although I will say, and I mentioned earlier, that OVW, the Office on Violence Against Women's grant making, has increasingly taken on social and economic justice issues. That remains to be seen whether we will go in that direction. But although that's happened, VAWA is inherently a criminal justice package, and we talked about how it was originally a part of the crime bill in '94. And so that doesn't sufficiently take into consideration other important aspects that should be included in a national action plan. Others have touched upon these, I'll just name a few. Economic justice issues, access to affordable housing, health care, workplace policies, on domestic and sexual violence, public health perspective, kids in the juvenile justice system, et cetera. These things are scattered in different places. I talked about that earlier. There's no coordinated approach to bringing them all together to see how they are impacting folks in this country, whether we're talking about violence against women framework or a gender violence framework. And I don't have time to get into that distinction right now. The value of a national action plan is it would look more comprehensively at all of these different issues as important aspects of preventing and addressing interpersonal violence and sexual assault with a lens of intersectionality and with a more coordinated approach across sectors along with benchmarks. And I just want to note that the United States has developed national action plans as it relates to gender violence outside the United States. So, UN Security Council Resolution 1325 addresses issues of women, peace, and security, looking at violence against women as a national security issue, for example. And UN Women and the United Nations have urged countries to adopt national action plans on women, peace, and security. And the United States has. We adopted this pursuant to an executive order. Here's the executive order from 2011. We also have an action plan, a United States strategy to prevent and respond to gender-based violence globally. There's amazing language in this action plan, but we don't see it as applying to ourselves, and that is a problem. We even have a assessments of implementation of that action plan, right? The second and third generation type action plans that I talked about. And the State Department and USAID each have focused on that. We also have a federal strategic action plan on services for victims of human trafficking. So we do have some action plans in this country that were developed under the Obama administration that encapsulate some of this vision. But again, they are for specific forms of violence. And in this case, human trafficking, which has all sorts of other connotations, and the way in which this was, action plan was formed was both very important but also highly problematic. I don't have time to get into that right now. We have a national HIV/AIDS strategy for the United States. It contains a vision statement, an implementation strategy, action items, goals, and 5 core policy recommendations to address the intersection of violence against women and girls and gender-related health disparities stemming from a 2012 presidential memorandum directing the White House Office of National HIV/AIDS Policy to prioritize this nexus in future planning efforts. Okay, I only have probably 1 more minute. So I just want to note really quick that the idea of a national action plan, like no ideas are new, right? This is not some brilliant idea that I had. This is actually contained in the most amazing book that I brought, if anybody wants to check it out. I was not aware of this. I confess my ignorance. There was a 1977 Congress in Houston. Well, I'm holding up the same picture, but this is a whole report that was presented to President Carter called The Spirit of Houston, all about proposing a 26-plank national action plan, which incorporated all of the different issues, for the most part, with the notable exception of LGBT issues that we've been talking about today. And so it's quite interesting and frightening to see kind of where we are literally 40 years later, excuse me. And the last idea I'll just mention, as I close, is that, as many of us have pointed out today, now I don't think is the time for a new national level action plan strategizing. We certainly don't want the Trump administration being in charge of that, nor do I think they would be interested in taking on that endeavor. But I do want to suggest, though, that this is an idea that we may consider bringing to municipalities and states, and should do so in kind of that networked and collective way that Elizabeth mentioned earlier. So one vehicle to accomplish this, and I'll just close here, might be in the 30 or so municipalities that have adopted resolutions declaring that freedom from domestic violence is a fundamental human right. And this is a project that I've worked on with Lee and several other law clinics across the country, where we have worked with mostly law students to get local city councils to pass resolutions. And for the most part, these resolutions are just that, resolutions. In some cities, they have accompanying legislation or a report writing that is that local task forces are tasked with. But especially in progressive jurisdictions, now might be an interesting time where local plans of action could be established that could capture a vision that is both proactive and reactive and reflect what freedom from gender violence truly looks like. They could also prioritize the populations who are being erased or undermined by federal policymaking in the Trump era. So with that, I will close, and thanks so much for having me. And Casey.